Move, veteran! Or I'll move myself!
Dale Rusk shouted across the frozen yard, where a demolition notice snapped against the fence post. Snow whipped across the old Red Maple Schoolhouse as Owen Mercer stood on the porch, one hand resting on Slate's collar, the other gripping a cold iron pry bar. The town had already written the place off. But Slate knew something no one else could sense. If that west wall came down, it would expose more than rotten wood. Then Slate stepped forward. The old dog lunged at the wall, clawing and whining, like something behind the boards was still breathing. Owen turned white, because that wall was supposed to be empty. Owen Mercer had learned that a door could close quietly and still sound like a verdict. In Cedar Hollow, New Hampshire, people were polite enough not to stare too long, but not kind enough to stop whispering once he passed. They knew him as the tall man who patched roofs, fixed doors, mended fences, and sanded old floors until the grain came back like memory. He was 41, though some mornings his face carried the stillness of places he never named. Owen had served with an Army engineer unit, where his job had been to look at broken things and decide, quickly and without comfort, whether they could stand another hour. Bridges with cracked supports, walls with heat scars, roads chewed open by blast and weather. He had been good at it. Too good, some said. He could hear trouble in the groan of a beam. He could read a ceiling by the way dust fell from it. But after he came home, nobody asked him what he could still read. They mostly noticed what made them uneasy: the way he slept little, the way his eyes moved first to exits, the way a dropped wrench could freeze him for half a breath before he remembered where he was. He rented a narrow room behind Greeley's Auto Parts, a low building at the edge of town, where the smell of oil, rubber, and wet cardboard clung to everything. It had never been a proper lease, just a weekly cash arrangement behind the shop, which made it easier for people to call cruelty a business decision. The room was narrow, with one window, a hot plate, and a faucet that knocked in the pipes. It was not much, but Owen kept it clean. His boots stayed lined beneath the bed, and his tools were wiped down every night, even when he was too tired to eat. Beside the door always was Slate. The German Shepherd was large and gray-white, his coat the color of ash under new snow, with amber eyes that missed nothing, and one torn ear that gave him a permanently listening look. Slate had once been trained to search collapsed structures, to move through dust and broken concrete, to find the living where human voices could not reach. Then came the injury to his rear leg, the limp that worsened in cold weather, the evaluation papers, the careful language people use when they are done with something, but want to sound gentle about it. No longer suitable for active deployment. Owen had read those words on Slate's file the day they met through a veteran support program, and he remembered feeling a strange, sharp recognition, as if someone had written the same sentence across his own chest. Slate did not wag much. Owen did not smile much. But they had built a life out of small understandings. Slate knew when to press his muzzle against Owen's wrist. Owen knew which mornings the dog's hip needed warming before they walked. They were not dramatic about loyalty. They simply stayed. Late in November, on a Thursday afternoon, Owen came back from repairing wind damage on a dairy barn outside town. His gloves were stiff with tar. His shoulders ached from bracing himself against the roof pitch. He had been thinking about canned soup, dry socks, and whether Slate would be waiting under the side awning or already pacing for dinner. But the door did not open. A new padlock hung from the latch, bright brass against the weathered wood. For a moment Owen only looked at it, his hand still holding the key that no longer belonged to anything. Then he saw the canvas bags on the porch. 3 of them, his clothes, his tool roll, his old boots, Slate's steel water bowl, set upside down beside them like a small final insult. A folded note had been tucked under a brick. Owen picked it up and read the words once, then again, though he understood them the first time. Effective immediately. No longer suitable. Liability concerns. He stood very still. Inside the auto parts shop, someone moved behind the frosted glass, but no one came out. Slate had been tied under the side awning, with his blanket bunched beside him, as if someone had decided the dog was part of the belongings too. The dog looked at the bags, then at the locked door, then up at Owen. He did not bark. Owen did not knock. There were things a man could ask for, and things he knew had already been decided before his voice entered the room. The wind pushed dry leaves along the gravel lot. A flag rope clinked against the pole near the shop. Across the street, a woman leaving the post office paused just long enough to see, then lowered her eyes and kept walking. Owen folded the note carefully, because old habits do not disappear just because dignity has been taken from you. He slipped it into his coat pocket, untied Slate from the awning post, picked up the bags and whistled once. The dog rose despite the stiffness in his leg and stood close enough that his shoulder brushed Owen's knee. Together they faced the narrow road leading out of town, the early dark settling over Cedar Hollow, the cold sharpening around them. For the first time in years, Owen Mercer did not know where he would sleep, and Slate, who had been trained to find people buried beneath ruins, stayed beside the one man who had no roof left above him. Before Owen Mercer became the man standing in a gravel lot with all he owned packed into 3 canvas bags, he had been the man people sent in first when something looked ready to fall. In the army, his work had not been loud or glorious. It was dust, twisted steel, and buildings that looked solid until you knew where to place your boot. There were bridges that sagged like tired shoulders over brown water, roads split open by heat and force, walls blistered by fire. Owen had been trained to study damage without flinching. A crack down a foundation meant one thing. A stair dipping toward the center meant another. Water damage could hide behind plaster for years before showing its face. The world, he learned, rarely broke all at once. It warned you first. It creaked, it bowed, it shifted by an inch, then another, until the day everyone else called it sudden. Owen's job was to notice before that day came. He could stand in a doorway and feel the building breathe around him. He could hear hollowness in the note of old pine when he tapped it with the back of his knuckles. He could run his palm along a beam and sense the difference between age and surrender. People trusted that in him once. They trusted his eyes, his hands, his quiet judgment. If Owen said a wall would hold, men walked beneath it. If Owen said move, they moved. That kind of trust did something to a man. It gave him weight in the world. It made his silence useful. Then he came home, and silence became the thing people mistrusted most. Cedar Hollow saw only pieces of him. The man who fixed gutters but never stayed for coffee. The man who paid in folded bills. The man who turned his head too quickly when a car backfired near the square. They did not see the discipline it took for him to arrive, on time after a night without sleep. They did not see him sitting on the edge of his bed at 2 a.m, both feet planted on the floor, counting the boards beneath him until the room settled back into New Hampshire. They did not see how carefully he placed his screwdriver down when his fingers began to tremble, how he waited for the shake to pass instead of forcing the screw and stripping it. He still said yes, Mom, to Mrs. Leland at the hardware counter, and carried heavy feed bags for older men who pretended not to need help. He still returned borrowed tools cleaner than he received them. He still paid what he owed when he had it, and when he did not, he worked until the balance was gone. But there are places that call a man reliable only when his damage stays invisible. Slate understood that without ever needing words for it. Slate had his own weather inside him. On cold mornings, his rear legs stiffened before sunrise, and Owen would warm an old towel near the radiator and lay it over the joint until Slate's breathing softened. The dog disliked sirens, not with panic, but with a deep stillness that came over him like frost. He did not trust hands reaching quickly for his collar. He would step back, amber eyes calm but final, as if drawing a line no one had the right to cross. Some people took that for aggression. Owen knew better. Slate had searched broken buildings. He had crawled through spaces too narrow for men, followed scent through dust and rain and wet concrete, found life beneath ruin because someone had once believed he could. Then one injury, one limp, one report written in clean professional language, and the work was over. Too limited, too unpredictable, too much risk. Owen had heard those words around him too, though usually people softened them before they spoke. That was why he never called Slate a pet. Pet sounded too small. Partner was the word that fit. A partner did not need you cheerful. A partner stayed by the door when sleep would not come. A partner limped beside you without asking where the road ended. That evening, after the locked door and the folded note and the woman crossing the street with her eyes lowered, Owen carried the bags to the edge of town and stopped beneath a bare maple where the last brown leaves rattled like dry paper. The sky had gone pewter gray. Slate lowered himself slowly onto the ground, favoring his bad leg, but his eyes stayed on Owen. For a while, the man and the dog listened to Cedar Hollow settling into evening, a truck passing on Main, the faint bell above the diner door, wind moving through empty branches. Owen looked at his hands, scarred, capable, unsteady. He had spent half his life judging what could still be saved. A bridge, a roof, a wall, a road. He had never learned what signs to look for in himself. Slate rose then with effort and leaned his shoulder against Owen's knee. Not hard, just enough. Owen let out a breath he had not known he was holding and rested one hand on the dog's ash-colored head. "All right, partner," he said quietly. "Let's keep moving." Winslow Ridge Road left Cedar Hollow quietly, passing the last clapboard houses before narrowing between frost-silver fields and dark pines. 4 miles out, where the road bent around a low stone wall and began climbing toward the ridge, Red Maple Schoolhouse stood alone under the leaning shadow of an old tree. It was a one-room schoolhouse, built long before Cedar Hollow had traffic lights or a county office with fluorescent bulbs. White pine boards, local stone foundation, steep roof, tall windows, a small bell tower with rust along its seams. The paint had peeled away in long curls, exposing gray wood beneath like tired skin. One shutter hung crooked. The front steps had sunk unevenly into the ground. Above the door, a wooden sign still held the name, though rain and years had softened the letters until they looked less written than remembered. Red Maple Schoolhouse. In fall, the tree out front burned red for 2 clean weeks. By late November, that brightness was gone. The branches were bare now, black against a low sky, and the leaves lay flattened around the steps, like old letters no one had opened. There had been a time when Red Maple was not lonely. Ellen Barrow remembered that time better than most. At 72, she kept records in the county office, though records was too small a word for what she guarded. Deeds, ledgers, tax maps, storm reports, old photographs, the small paper bones of a place that pretended it had no history until someone threatened to tear a piece of it down. Ellen had lived in Cedar Hollow all her life, and she still called the schoolhouse by its full name. Not that old school, not the building on Winslow Ridge, Red Maple Schoolhouse. She said it the way some people said a family name. It had been built by farmers, mill workers, carpenters, and stone men, who gave Saturdays they could not spare because they believed a town needed more than houses and a road. Inside was one wide room with pine floorboards, a blackboard that ran nearly the length of the west wall, a pot-bellied iron stove in the corner, wooden coat hooks near the entrance, and windows tall enough to make morning feel almost holy when the sun came through them. People had come there in muddy boots and work coats, carrying lunch tins, ledgers, seed catalogs, letters from distant relatives, bills they needed help understanding, and questions they were embarrassed to ask anywhere else. Red Maple had taught Cedar Hollow more than reading and numbers. It had taught the town that a person could arrive uncertain and leave standing a little straighter. That was what Ellen remembered when others saw only rot. The county saw liability. The insurance man saw risk. The demolition contractor saw a narrow job on a winter schedule before deep snow made the ridge road difficult. The minutes from the last board meeting described Red Maple as structurally compromised, unused since 2003, and unsuitable for public access. Ellen had typed those words herself, each one feeling like a nail driven into something still breathing. The truth was simpler and sadder. Red Maple had not been abandoned in a single day. It had been praised first, preserved in speeches, promised a future as a heritage site. Then came a new community center downtown, a larger parking lot, a budget shortfall, a storm that cracked 2 windows, a roof leak no one repaired, and one winter followed by another, until neglect began to look like evidence. People pointed at the sagging porch and said, "See, too far gone." Ellen knew better. Too far gone was a phrase people used when they did not want to confess they had stopped showing up. That afternoon, while Owen Mercer and Slate stood beneath a bare maple at the edge of town with nowhere to sleep, Ellen was in the records room sliding an old file box back onto a shelf. She paused when her fingers brushed the folder marked Red Maple Schoolhouse, Transforopazation's Demolition Review. Through the small office window she could see the sky lowering over Cedar Hollow, the first hint of snow gathering in the clouds. She thought of the schoolhouse at the end of Winslow Ridge Road, its bell tower rusting in the cold, its windows staring out across the empty field, its one room holding dust, silence, and whatever was left of all the people who had once walked through its door, hoping not to be laughed at for wanting to begin again. Ellen stood there longer than she meant to. Then she took the folder down, opened it, and read the line at the bottom of the page. Nominal transfer permitted prior to demolition authorization. $10. That was what the county had decided the old place was worth, if anyone wanted the burden of saving it. It had gone through 2 public notices with no buyer, and $10 was not the value of Red Maple so much as the county's way of letting go of responsibility. Ellen looked at those words, then toward the darkening street beyond the glass. By then, word of the padlock behind Greeley's had already traveled faster than kindness. Somewhere in town, she knew there was a man people had also begun describing with careful, dismissive language, unstable, difficult, not suitable. A man with a wounded shepherd who watched doors the way old buildings watched weather. Ellen closed the folder and held it against her chest. For the first time in months, Red Maple Schoolhouse did not feel like a problem waiting to be erased. It felt like a question waiting for the right person to answer. By the time Owen Mercer reached the county office, the cold had worked its way through his coat and settled between his ribs. He had carried the 3 canvas bags as far as the square before his shoulders made him stop. The tool roll weighed more than the clothes, but he would have left the clothes before he left the tools. A man could lose a room, a bed, a shelf with his shaving kit on it. Losing the tools felt closer to losing the last language he still spoke well. Slate walked beside him, close but not crowding, snow melting slowly along his back. The county office was still open, though most of the lights had already gone soft and yellow behind the windows. Owen stood outside for a moment before going in, not because he was ashamed of needing help, but because he did not know how to ask for it without sounding like a man asking to be pitied. The bell over the door gave a small, tired ring when he entered. Ellen Barrow looked up from behind the counter, reading glasses low on her nose, a stack of file folders at her elbow. She took in the bags, the worn coat, the dog waiting just inside the doorway. The way Owen kept one hand resting lightly on Slate's head without seeming aware of it. She did not say, "What happened?" She did not say, "Are you all right?" Those questions, Owen had learned, often required a performance from the person being asked. Instead, Ellen closed the folder in front of her and said, "Evening, Mr. Mercer." Owen removed his cap. "Mom." His voice sounded rough from the cold and from holding too much inside it. "I was wondering if the county had any work. Maybe a property that needs watching over. Something empty for the winter. I can repair things." "I don't need much." Ellen studied him, not the way others did, with their quick measuring and quicker conclusions, but slowly, as if she were examining an old map and trying to remember where a road used to be. "You still know your way around old buildings?" she asked. Owen glanced down once at Slate, then back at her. "I know how to look at what's still standing." Something shifted in Ellen's face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition, maybe. 10 minutes later, they were in her aging Subaru, Owen in the passenger seat with the canvas bags in back, and Slate stretched carefully across the cargo area, his injured leg tucked close. Ellen drove out of town without much conversation. The road climbed through fields silvered with frost, then narrowed under pines that leaned in from both sides. When they turned onto Winslow Ridge Road, a thin wash of snow lay over the dead grass and the stone walls. At the bend, Red Maple Schoolhouse appeared out of the gray afternoon, like a memory that had waited too long to be spoken. Owen did not get out right away. He sat looking through the windshield at the white boards, the sagging porch, the little bell tower rusted brown at the seams, the red maple tree bare and bent before it. The building looked tired, yes, wounded, neglected, but not finished. Ellen cut the engine. For a few seconds they listened to the wind move across the ridge. It found the bell tower and made a faint metal sound, not a ring, not even close, just a thin tremble, like a voice clearing itself after years of silence. "County wants it gone before Christmas," Ellen said. "They're worried the roof won't take another hard snow." Owen opened the door and stepped out. Slate followed, landing carefully, then stood with his nose lifted, reading the air. The front door stuck when Ellen tried it, swollen from damp. Owen set his shoulder lightly against the frame, lifted as he pushed, and the door gave with a wooden complaint. Cold air breathed out from inside. The room was dim, but the tall windows still held the last of the day. Owen stepped over the threshold and stopped. Dust lay over everything in a patient gray skin. Pine floorboards ran the length of the room, scratched and warped near the windows, but not rotted through. A long blackboard covered the west wall, its lower corner cracked, its surface clouded with old chalk. The pot-bellied stove stood near the front, red with rust around the legs but solid in the body. Coat hooks lined one wall. A teacher's desk sat crooked near the board. Above it all, water stains spread across the ceiling in brown-edged maps, ugly but honest. Owen walked slowly, the way he had once walked through buildings, where a careless step could change the day. He touched a sill, pressed 2 fingers into a soft patch, tapped the floor with his boot heel, looked up at the rafters. Ellen watched from near the doorway. She did not interrupt. Slate moved differently. He did not wander like a curious dog. He searched, nose low, tail still, ears angled forward. He passed the stove, circled the teacher's desk, then stopped at the west wall, where several old boards had been fitted below the blackboard, close to the stovepipe. He lowered his muzzle to the baseboard and breathed in, once, twice. Then he looked back at Owen. Owen noticed, but only half. "Mouse nest, maybe," he said. "Or moisture." Slate kept looking at him. Ellen's eyes moved from the dog to the wall, then back again, but she said nothing. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. "There's a nominal transfer option," she said finally. $10. Buyer assumes responsibility for repairs, insurance, and any failure of the structure. No warranty, no county assistance. Owen almost laughed. But there was no humor in him to carry it. $10. The price of a sandwich and coffee. The price of a building everyone had stopped believing in. He reached into his wallet. There was one bill left, folded behind an old VA appointment card and a receipt from the hardware store, a 10. He held it in his hand for a long moment. He thought of the locked room behind Greeley's, the upside-down water bowl, the note folded in his coat pocket. He thought of Slate's file, those clean words that had ended the dog's working life, no longer suitable. Owen looked around the schoolhouse again, the cracked blackboard, the cold stove, the high windows still catching light, the door that had stuck but opened. "I'll sign," he said. Ellen did not smile, not quite. But her shoulders lowered, as if she had been holding up some small piece of the past and could finally set it down. Later, back at the office, Owen printed his name on the transfer form with a hand that did not shake. Ellen slid the paper across the counter, and he gave her the $10 bill. Slate sat beside him, his torn ear tilted toward the quiet scratch of the pen. Owen Mercer did not buy Red Maple Schoolhouse because he knew what tomorrow would look like. He bought it because every other door had closed, and this one, old and swollen and stubborn as it was, had opened when he leaned his shoulder against it. Night came down over Red Maple Schoolhouse without ceremony, the way it does in places no one is watching. By 6 o'clock, Cedar Hollow had disappeared beyond the ridge, leaving only the dark outline of pines, the pale field beyond the windows, and the old schoolhouse standing against the cold like something too tired to ask for mercy. Owen Mercer brought in his 3 canvas bags, one at a time, then the tool roll, then the folded tarp Ellen had found in the trunk of her Subaru, and insisted he take. He did not thank her too much. Men like Owen had learned that gratitude, if spoken too heavily, could sound like begging. So he simply nodded, said, "I'll bring it back clean," and watched her taillights vanish down Winslow Ridge Road. After that, there was only him, Slate, and the building. He worked by flashlight. He pulled the last broken glass from the north window, dropped the shards into an old coffee can, and stretched the tarp across the opening. The wind pushed at it immediately, making the blue plastic snap and breathe, but it held, not well, not beautifully, but enough. Enough was a word Owen trusted. He set his toolbox beside the pot-bellied stove, though there was no firewood yet, and no way to know if the flue was clear. The stove crouched in the corner, rusted and cold, its iron belly wider than he expected, its little door hanging slightly crooked. He touched it once with the backs of his fingers. The metal was bitter with cold, but solid. "Not tonight," he murmured, though whether he spoke to the stove, the building, or himself, he could not have said. Slate made a slow round of the room, his nails ticking softly against the pine floor. Every sound seemed too clear in that empty place. The scrape of Owen's boot, the creak of a board, the faint flutter of paper on the bulletin board near the door. There were still notices pinned there, curled brown at the corners, a schedule from some forgotten town meeting, a flyer for a winter bake sale long past, a handwritten note about bringing extra kindling for the stove. Owen shined his light across them, then away. Some things were sadder when they were ordinary. He spread his coat on the floor near the stove and sat with his back to the wall, one knee raised, the toolbox within reach. Slate lowered himself between Owen and the front door, as he always did, careful with his bad leg, then rested his chin on his paws. The dog's body made a low silver shape in the darkness, half shadow, half snow, for a while. Neither of them moved. The building settled around them. Wind threaded through seams in the boards with a thin, whistling sound. Dry leaves scratched under the porch. Somewhere above, a loose strip of metal gave a soft tap each time the gusts found it. The smell of the room deepened as the cold came on. Chalk dust, damp wood, old iron, and the faint sweetness of pine giving back a century of summers. Owen let the flashlight beam drift over the blackboard. At first he saw only dust, a gray veil across the slate surface. Then beneath it, near the center, a line of pale chalk appeared. So faded it seemed less written than breathed there. "Begin again where you are." Owen stared at it. The words were simple enough to belong on any schoolhouse board, the kind of thing a teacher might write on a Monday morning without knowing anyone would ever need it years later. But alone in that cold room, with his belongings in bags and a $10 deed folded in his coat pocket, the sentence did not feel simple. It felt aimed. He read it once. Then again. His throat tightened in a way that annoyed him. So he looked down and placed his hand on Slate's head. The dog did not lift his eyes. He only exhaled, warm against the floor. "Guess this is where we are," Owen whispered. He must have slept, because he woke to Slate standing. No growl, no bark, just the quiet absence of the dog beside the door. Owen's hand went automatically to the flashlight. The room was black except for a faint square of moonlight where the tarp shifted at the window. Slate stood by the west wall, near the old boards beneath the blackboard and close to the stovepipe. His ears were forward, his body still. He lowered his muzzle to the baseboard and breathed in slowly, as if reading a message buried deeper than scent. Then he lifted one paw and scraped the wood. Once, lightly, not frantic, not playful, deliberate. Owen pushed himself upright, every tired muscle protesting. "Slate," he said softly. The dog did not turn. He scraped again. The sound small but sharp in the room. Owen shined the light over the wall. The boards looked like every other tired board in the building, stained, warped at the seams, nailed down long ago by hands that had probably expected them to stay forgotten. "Leave it," Owen said, gentler this time. Slate paused. His head turned halfway toward Owen, amber eyes catching the beam. For a second, something passed between them. Not obedience exactly, not refusal either. A question. Then Slate came back and lowered himself near the door, though he did not put his head down. His eyes stayed on the west wall. Owen sat awake long after that, listening to the wind, the building, the old dog's breathing, and the faint, quiet place behind the boards where Slate seemed to know something was waiting. Owen Mercer began repairing Red Maple Schoolhouse the way a man might speak after years of silence. Not all at once, not gracefully, but with care enough to mean it. Morning belonged to whatever work Cedar Hollow would give him. He patched a leak above the barber shop, replaced porch boards for Mrs. Talbot, and rehung a storm door that had been dragging since August. He took payment in small bills, sometimes in supplies. Once in a half-used box of galvanized nails, a farmer said had been sitting in his shed since his brother moved to Ohio. Owen accepted everything without making it feel like charity. "That'll help," he would say, and because he said it plainly, people let the kindness pass as practicality. Afternoons belonged to Red Maple. He would walk up Winslow Ridge Road with Slate at his side, the dog's limp more noticeable when the air turned hard and bright. At the schoolhouse, Owen worked until the light thinned. He pulled broken glass from the frames, swept dead leaves from the corners, and set temporary braces beneath a soft patch of ceiling. Then he scraped the front steps in slow, stubborn strokes, white curls of paint falling around his boots. He marked every crack with pencil, not to accuse the walls, but to remember where they needed watching. On the back of a county envelope, he wrote a repair list in small block letters: roof, west wall, stovepipe, porch rail, floor. The list grew faster than his money, but Owen did not crumple it up. A list was not failure. A list was proof he had looked closely enough to know where to begin. Slate stayed near him through it all. When Owen climbed the ladder, Slate lay beneath it, with his head lifted, as if holding the ground in place by attention alone. When the hammer struck too loud and Owen's shoulders locked before he could stop them, Slate rose, crossed the room, and pressed his muzzle against Owen's knee. No drama, no command. Just warmth through denim, weight against bone, the simple insistence of another living thing saying, here, not there. When Owen sat too long on the edge of the teacher's desk, with the screwdriver loose in his hand, Slate placed one heavy paw over the toe of his boot and waited. The schoolhouse began to change in ways no one driving past would have noticed. The tarp at the window stopped snapping so hard. The front step no longer tipped under Owen's weight. One corner of the floor, scrubbed with soap and a brush until his wrist ached, showed the honey color of old pine beneath the dirt. That little square of clean wood did something to him. He found himself looking at it when the rest of the room felt too large, a small bright country on a floor still mostly gray. People passed by sometimes. Trucks slowed near the bend. Faces turned. A few hands lifted in awkward greeting. Others did not. Cedar Hollow did not know what to make of a man living in a schoolhouse, marked for demolition with a wounded dog and a toolbox. So it did what towns often do when unsure whether to be kind. It watched. One afternoon, Dale Rusk stopped his pickup by the ditch and leaned out the open window. Dale was a local carpenter, broad through the chest, red-faced from weather and opinion, the kind of man who spoke as if every sentence had already been agreed upon by better men somewhere else. Mercer, he called. Owen was on the porch, scraping paint from the rail. You're wasting good hours. Owen kept the scraper moving. Could be. Dale looked at the sagging roofline, the patched tarp, the rusted bell tower. Some things cost more to fix than they're worth. Best thing is clear it down and start from dirt. The scraper paused. Not long, just enough for Slate, lying in the doorway, to lift his head. Owen did not answer, because he had learned that certain words were built like traps. Step into them, and you spent the rest of the day proving you had a right to stand where you already stood. Dale drove on, tires crunching over gravel, but the sentence stayed. It moved with Owen through the rest of the afternoon, under the sound of sanding, under the scrape of broom bristles, under the metallic cough of the old stove door when he tested its hinge. Some things cost more to fix than they're worth. By dusk, the room had gone blue with cold. Owen stood in the center of the schoolhouse, hands dirty, shoulders sore, looking at all that remained undone. Water stains spread across the ceiling. The west wall boards near the stove still bothered Slate. The black board's corner was split. The stove was red with rust. His own breath showed in the air. Under the east window, Slate lay with his injured leg stretched out, the muscle trembling faintly from the cold, despite the folded blanket Owen had placed there. Owen watched that tremor and felt something in his chest tighten, not sharply, but slowly, like a knot being pulled. They said that about us, didn't they? He said. So quietly, the room seemed to catch the words before they fell. Slate lifted his head. His amber eyes found Owen's face, calm, tired, knowing nothing of speeches and everything of staying. Owen crossed the room, knelt beside him. and rubbed the warm place between the dog's ears. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge. Inside, in a schoolhouse everyone else had already measured for loss. One man and one dog remained, not healed, not whole, not even close, but still standing, and for that night, standing was enough. The west wall had been waiting longer than Owen understood. He came to it on a gray afternoon when the sky hung low over Winslow Ridge and the cold had a damp edge that made old injuries speak up. Slate had been restless since morning, not pacing, not whining, just watching that side of the room with a stillness Owen had learned not to dismiss. Water had stained the boards below the blackboard, and the narrow strip of paneling near the pot-bellied stove had begun to bow outward. Just enough for a man like Owen to notice. If moisture had gotten behind it, the wall could rot quietly through winter and give way under the first heavy thaw. So he set his tools on the floor, rolled his sleeves, and began. The first nail came out with a long, complaining squeal. The wood resisted, swollen with age and damp, and when Owen eased the flat bar beneath the edge, dust spilled down in a soft gray curtain. The smell that rose from behind it was older than mold, older than mouse nests, something dry and sealed and faintly metallic. Slate stood at once. Not fast, because his bad leg would not allow fast anymore, but with the sudden purpose of a working dog remembering he had once been needed for exactly this. He crossed the room and came close to Owen's shoulder, nose low, ears forward, amber eyes fixed on the gap. Owen paused, one hand still gripping the pry bar. "Easy," he murmured. Slate did not look at him. He pressed his muzzle near the baseboard and drew in a slow breath. Then he lifted one paw and scraped at a point just below the second board. Once, then again. Owen watched him for several seconds. There were times a dog smelled what a man could not, and there were times a partner knew to listen. Owen tapped the wall with his knuckles. The sound was wrong, not the dull thud of wet plaster, not the thin rattle of empty paneling. Hollow but contained, like a small room inside, the wall had been built to keep a secret from weather and time. He removed the second board, then the third. The nails were old square-cut nails, stubborn as buried teeth. One snapped, one bent. One came loose so suddenly, Owen scraped his thumb against the grain and left a dark smear of blood on the pale wood. Slate leaned closer, his body tense but controlled, not excited, not afraid, waiting. Behind the boards was a narrow cavity framed carefully between two studs, too neat to be damage, too clean to be chance. Owen shined his flashlight inside, and for a moment all he saw was dust and the brown edge of newspaper. Then shapes appeared. A faded butter cookie tin, a glass jar wrapped in yellowed newspaper, two oilcloth pouches tied with brown cord, and behind them, a cream-colored envelope gone soft at the corners. Owen reached in slowly, the way he might reach toward something fragile enough to punish haste. He set each item on the floorboards between himself and Slate. The dog sat down beside him without being told. He did not wag. He did not sniff the objects now that they were out. He simply watched Owen, quiet and steady, as if the discovery belonged less to his nose than to the schoolhouse itself. On the envelope, written in a careful, slanted hand, were the words, "For the one who keeps the school standing." Owen read them once, then lowered himself fully onto the floor. The room seemed to grow larger around him. Outside, wind worried the tarp over the broken window. Inside, the old stove stood cold, the blackboard watched from above, and dust drifted in the flashlight beam like pale ash. He opened the tin first. Money lay inside, folded in paper bands, worn but kept with care. The jar held more, so did the pouches. Every stack had been sorted with a patience that made Owen's hands slow. Between the stacks were slips of paper, each marked with amounts in different handwriting. 20, 50, 100. A few had no names, for Red Maple someday. Owen counted once and did not trust himself. Counted again, slower. By the third count, the number stayed the same, $30,000. He sat back against the wall and closed his eyes, but only for a second. Not from joy. Joy would have been too simple for what passed through him. This was disbelief first, then fear, then a kind of ache so deep it felt almost like being seen. $30,000 hidden in a wall everyone else had called worthless. $30,000 inside a schoolhouse the county had priced at 10. Slate shifted closer and rested his chin on Owen's knee. Only then did Owen pick up the envelope. His thumb hesitated beneath the flap. He thought of locked doors, folded notices, careful words like liability, and no longer suitable. He thought of Slate standing at this wall night after night, knowing there was something here even when Owen had not yet learned to believe him. The envelope opened with a dry whisper. Inside was a letter, several pages folded together, written in the same slanted hand. At the bottom of the first page was a name, Margaret Wren. Owen stared at it, and somehow, before he read another word, the money on the floor became smaller. The real thing, whatever it was, had been waiting in the letter. Margaret Wren's letter began without ceremony, as if she had expected whoever found it to be sitting on the floor with dust on his hands and more questions than breath. To the one who has opened this wall, she wrote, "I hope you did not break it in anger. I hope you are here because you saw something worth keeping." Owen read the sentence once, then lowered the page a little, because the room around him had gone strangely quiet. Slate's chin rested on his knee, warm through the worn fabric of his work pants. The money sat between them in careful stacks, ordinary paper made heavy by years. But the letter had already changed the weight of the room. Margaret's handwriting was thin and slanted, the kind made by a hand that had written on chalkboards, envelopes, and names people were still learning to sign without shame. She wrote that she had never owned much worth hiding. No land beyond a small house near the creek. No secret fortune, no inheritance, no jewelry except a wedding band gone loose with age. What she had, she wrote, was Red Maple Schoolhouse, though the deed had never carried her name. She had taught there, swept there, locked its door in storms, lit the pot-bellied stove before dawn on winter mornings, and after the county closed it in 2003, she had continued coming once a week, because some places should not be left to learn loneliness too quickly. No one ever asked for the key back, and Margaret took that as permission to keep caring. Owen pictured her then, though he had never seen her, an older woman in a wool coat, carrying a broom and a jar of wildflowers, stepping carefully up the same porch he had scraped with numb fingers. Margaret wrote of people who came after long shifts, bad harvests, layoffs, and funerals. Their hands were rough from work, yet still trembled over forms. Some could build a shed straight and strong, but had never been taught how to read a mortgage line by line. They learned arithmetic there. They learned to read bank notices, repair manuals, medicine labels, and letters they no longer had to hand to someone else. They learned to sign their names. Not mark an X, not look away, sign. Margaret wrote that the first time someone signed his own name with a steady hand, the room changed. Not loudly, no applause, just a small lifting, as if the ceiling had risen an inch. Owen stopped there. He looked up at the blackboard, at the dusty words still faint in chalk. Begin again where you are. For the first time, he wondered how many hands had held chalk in this room, with the same private fear he carried when he picked up a tool, and his fingers did not obey. The money, Margaret explained, had come slowly. $5 left in an envelope after a harvest supper. $12 from a woman who had once learned bookkeeping in that room, and later opened a sewing shop. $20 from a truck driver who said Red Maple had taught him enough math to stop being cheated on fuel logs. $100 bill folded into a Christmas card with no signature. Margaret added what she could from her own pay, not because she was generous in any grand way. She wrote, but because she had watched good things disappear when people assumed someone else would save them. She hid the money after the first roof leak, when promises about preserving Red Maple began turning into meetings about cost. By the time the county began speaking of demolition in earnest, Margaret Wren had been gone for years. If you found this, she wrote, then perhaps the town forgot. I do not blame them. Forgetting is often easier than repairing. But if your hands are on these pages, perhaps you remembered for them. Owen's eyes moved down the page and stopped at a paragraph underlined once in fading blue ink. Please do not pity this old schoolhouse. Pity is what people give when they have already decided something is finished. Respect is different. Respect asks what can still be saved. He read it again, then again slower. The words did not strike him like thunder. They entered more quietly than that, like warmth finding its way through a wall after the stove has been lit. Owen had been pitied before. He recognized the shape of it. Lowered voices, careful smiles, offers made with one hand already pulling back. Pity made a man feel like a broken chair placed at the curb with a note taped to it. Respect was rarer. Respect handed you a tool and made room beside the workbench. Margaret Wren had never known Owen Mercer. She had never seen Slate's torn ear, or the locked door behind Greeley's auto parts, or the county form folded in his coat. And still, from years before, she had written directly toward the place in him no one in Cedar Hollow had bothered to address. Owen set the pages carefully on the floorboards. His thumb left a faint mark of dust near the margin. For a long time he did not speak. Slate lifted his head and leaned harder against him, the old dog's weight steady and unquestioning. Outside, wind dragged across the ridge and pressed at the tarp. Inside, the hidden money lay in the open. But it no longer felt like rescue. It felt like responsibility. It felt like someone had placed a key in Owen's palm and said, "Not you, poor man, but I believe you can keep this standing." Owen gathered the letter, folded it along its old creases, and held it against his chest for one brief second before slipping it back into the envelope. "All right, Margaret," he whispered into the cold room. "I'll do my best." Slate's tail moved once against the floor, soft as a broom across old pine. And for the first time since the padlock appeared on his rented room, Owen did not feel like a man looking for shelter. He felt like a man who had been given a reason to stay. Owen carried Margaret Wren's letter to Ellen Barrow the next morning in a coffee tin wrapped in his old field jacket, as if paper could bruise if handled carelessly. Ellen read it behind the county counter with both hands flat on the pages, her glasses slipping lower and lower until she finally took them off and pressed her thumb and forefinger against her eyes. She did not cry in any dramatic way. Ellen was not built for that. But when she looked up, something in her face had softened around the edges. She always did know how to wait a thing out, she said. The process that followed was not magical. It was forms, signatures, 2 meetings, 1 inspection, and more questions than Owen had patience for. The county attorney wanted proof. The board wanted receipts, and the insurance office wanted photographs from every angle, as if Red Maple might lie about its own condition. Owen answered what he could. Ellen answered what he could not. Slate came with him once and lay beneath the folding table in the county meeting room, still as winter light, while men in jackets talked about liability and precedent and cost. Owen kept one hand resting lightly against the dog's shoulder. When the final decision came, it was plain and cautious. Owen, as legal owner, could use the $30,000 for restoration, provided every expense was documented and the building met safety requirements before public use. The money would not fix everything, but it would buy materials, inspections, and enough time for Owen to do most of the labor himself. Owen folded the paper, placed it in his coat, and walked back to Red Maple without celebrating. He had never trusted good news until work had been done under it. The roof came first because Winter did not care about paperwork. He hired no crew at the beginning, only bought shingles, tar paper, flashing, and enough lumber to replace the worst of the water-eaten boards. Dale Rusk stopped by 2 days into it, stood at the edge of the yard with his hands in his coat pockets, and looked up at Owen braced on the roofline. "You'll get yourself hurt doing that alone," he called. Owen looked down. "Then hand me that bundle." Dale stared at him for a second, then gave a short laugh and carried the shingles up the ladder. He did not apologize for what he had said before. Owen did not ask him to. By sunset they had half the south side covered, and Dale left behind a box of roofing nails without mentioning it. After the roof came the windows. Owen found old panes from a barn outside Ashford, each one wavy in the glass, imperfect enough to belong. He cut his thumb twice fitting them into the frames. The third pane cracked straight across because his hands shook when a truck backfired down on the road. He stood there, breathing hard, jaw tight, furious at a piece of glass for telling the truth about him. Slate rose from his blanket and set one heavy paw over Owen's boot, steadying him without a sound. Owen closed his eyes, counted the boards beneath his boots, then started again. By the deep part of winter, light entered the schoolhouse differently. It no longer came through holes, it came through glass. He strengthened the floor near the teacher's desk, rebuilt the front steps, and cleaned the pot-bellied stove until black iron emerged beneath rust. Then he paid a chimney man from Conway to clear the flue. The first night the stove burned. Owen sat on the floor and watched the small orange fire take hold. Slate approached carefully, sniffed the warmth, turned once, and lowered himself onto the gray wool blanket Owen had bought him from the church thrift sale. The dog let out one long breath, the kind that seemed to years from his ribs. "Yeah," Owen whispered. "That's better." He ran basic wiring with help from a retired electrician who insisted he was only stopping by because he was bored. He brought water into a small back room with pipes that knocked and complained, then settled. He scrubbed the pine floor on his knees, one section at a time, until the grain rose gold beneath the dirt, like memory returning under a careful hand. He kept the cracked blackboard, the coat hooks, the teacher's desk with its old ink stains, and the little bell tower with its thin, uneven note. People began coming by before they admitted they were coming by. At first, they slowed their trucks near the bend. Then someone left scrap lumber near the porch. Mrs. Talbot brought a tin of screws in a paper bag. The feed store owner dropped off a half-gallon of white paint. Ellen arrived one afternoon with an old handbell wrapped in newspaper, the kind Margaret Wren had once used to call a room to attention. "Found it in storage," she said, though both of them knew she had been looking. Red Maple did not become a museum. Owen had no interest in making a place too precious to touch. He made it a home first, a cot in the back room, coffee on the hot plate, Slate's water bowl beneath the east window, a shelf for tools, clean curtains from donated flour sacks, the stove at the heart of it all. When the inspector finally signed off on the main room for limited evening use, Owen did not make an announcement. But on Thursday evenings, after the workday had ended, and the ridge road turned blue in the cold, he unlocked the schoolhouse door and wrote one sentence on the blackboard: "Bring what is broken. We'll look at it together." The first week, only Ellen came, carrying a loose drawer pull. The second week, Dale brought a chair with a split rung and pretended he had just been passing. Then came a woman from the laundromat with a lamp that flickered, a retired mail carrier with a picture frame, a mechanic with a hinge he could not get to sit right. Owen did not lecture. He did not call it healing. He showed them how to measure twice, how to hold a screw straight, how to sand with the grain, how to stop before anger ruined the work. Slate lay by the stove, watching each person with calm amber eyes. People learned not to rush toward him. They let him decide, and slowly, just as the schoolhouse had, the town began entering with more care. Winter arrived in Cedar Hollow, the way winter arrives in old New England towns, not by announcement, but by possession. It took the fields first, softened the stone walls, and laid itself across the roof of Red Maple Schoolhouse as gently as a hand over a sleeping brow. The old red maple stood bare in the yard, every branch outlined in white, its trunk leaning eastward as it always had, faithful in its crookedness. The front steps, once split and sunken, now held firm beneath the snow. The porch rail Owen had sanded smooth wore a thin, bright edge of frost. From the road, the schoolhouse no longer looked abandoned. It looked occupied by warmth. Light glowed in the tall windows, not harsh or modern, but amber, the kind that made glass look deeper than glass and turned falling snow into slow sparks. Inside, the Thursday gathering had ended an hour earlier. Dale Rusk had fixed the loose brace on an old footstool. Mrs. Talbot had learned how to tighten the hinge on a cabinet door without stripping the screw. Ellen Barrow had sat near the stove with her coat open. Pretending to mend a drawer handle she had already repaired twice, simply because she liked the sound of other people working quietly in the room. Now they were gone, their tire tracks filling softly behind them on the road, and Owen Mercer was alone with Slate and the small ordinary mess that meant a place had been used well. Wood shavings near the bench, a coffee cup forgotten on the teacher's desk, damp boot prints fading across the pine floor. Owen swept slowly, not because he was tired, though he was, but because he had come to love the sound of the broom against wood. It was a small sound, almost nothing, but in November, when he first stepped into Red Maple, the room had sounded hollow, as if every noise went looking for someone and found no one there. Now the broom moved through a room that answered back. The pot-bellied stove burned low in the corner, its iron belly breathing a steady heat. Slate lay on his gray wool blanket beside it, his body stretched long, his injured rear leg twitching once in a dream. The firelight touched Slate's coat and made the white along his muzzle look silver. On the blackboard beneath the old ghost of "Begin again where you are," Owen had written that evening's lesson in plain chalk. Measure twice, cut once, don't give up on good wood. He almost erased the last part. Then he left it, not because it was clever, but because it was true. A knock came softly at the open door. Ellen stood on the porch, with snow in the shoulders of her coat, and a manila envelope tucked beneath one arm. "Didn't want to leave this in the office another night," she said. Owen took it from her and opened it near the stove. Inside was a black and white photograph, curled at the corners. Margaret Wren stood in front of Red Maple Schoolhouse decades earlier, one hand resting on the porch rail, the other holding a ring of keys. Behind her, the white door was freshly painted. The red maple was younger then, but already leaning. Margaret did not smile exactly. She looked steady, as if the camera had interrupted her on the way to doing something useful. Owen turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same slanted hand as the letter, were the words, "Some places are not waiting to be saved. They are waiting to be seen." Ellen watched him read it. "Thought you should have that," she said. She did not stay long. People in Cedar Hollow were learning when to leave silence alone. After she drove away, Owen stepped onto the repaired porch with the photograph in his hand. Slate followed, slower now, and settled against his boot. Snow fell beyond the porch light, soft and steady like chalk dust shaken from a careful hand. The door behind them remained open, letting stove warmth and lamplight spill across the threshold. Owen looked at it. That door he had planed, rehung, painted, and fitted with a new lock he controlled from the inside. He thought of another door, bright padlock, upside-down water bowl, his life packed into bags. He thought of how a man could stand outside one ending and not know it was also the edge of a beginning. His hand came to rest on Slate's head. The old dog leaned into him, not needing praise, not asking for promises. Across the yard, Red Maple's windows shone into the snow. Owen did not feel rescued. Rescue had always sounded temporary, like being pulled from water and left shivering on shore. This was different. The schoolhouse had asked something of him. Slate had trusted him to listen. Margaret had trusted hands she would never see, and slowly, board by board, Owen had begun to trust himself again. Sometimes he thought, home was not the place that took you in when you were whole. Sometimes it was the place that looked at what remained, made room for your tools, warmed the floor beneath your tired dog, and waited while you learned how to stand. If Red Maple's story moved you, like this video and subscribe for more stories about loyalty and second chances. And tell us in the comments, which moment stayed with you most? And where are you watching from tonight?